Welcome to the start of Section 8 of the BJCP training program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. In this section, we are continuing our look at the basic ingredients of beer, this time malts and adjuncts. This is Lesson 1 of Section 8, and its focus is on barley malt. You'll hear the terms barley and malt a lot when discussing beer recipes, arguably malt more than the word barley, and that's simply because barley is the most common source of fermentable sugars in beer. The terms base malts, crystal malts, caramel malts, roasted malts, etc. all have a common trait. They all start as a barley kernel. These barley kernels are actually the seeds of a barley plant. Barley malt is formed by having these seeds sprout and letting the rootlets grow to a desired length. The rootlets are then stripped off of the barley seeds, which is now technically malted barley, and kiln dried to a specific color. We're going to get more into the specifics on both the malting and kilning process soon, so keep those two subjects in the back of your mind for now, knowing that we're going to dive into them a little bit more very shortly. Now let's take a look at the components of a barley kernel and what we need to know about them in terms of malting and in terms of the information that could be on our exams. First part of the barley we're going to look at is the germ component. The germ component of the kernel is the actual germinating portion of the barley kernel. There's also the endosperm, which accounts for a large portion of the kernel. This is the starch, food reserve, and food source for the germinating malt. These are both surrounded by the husk. The husk is almost entirely cellulose and will become an important component for filtering our grain bed when we brew our beer. And finally, for our purposes, the acrospire. This is the portion of the kernel that grows first when the seed is germinated. Let to fully grow and develop, it's the part of the plant that'll break out of the ground and turn into the shoot of the plant. Historically, as the acrospire grows from the germ, it's used to gauge the malting process. I'm going to move my pointer over a little bit just to show. As the length of this grows, that's where maltsters would historically, again, determine when the malting process is done and when to move on to the next step. But we still have some more things to talk about in terms of the barley kernel before we get to that. After the germination process is started and allowed to proceed, enzymes are activated and start acting on proteins and carbohydrates and start changing their structure. This degree of germination is called modification. Modification refers to the extent that the proteins of an endosperm have been broken down post-germination and now in this malting process. It also refers to the extent that these proteins are now soluble in water. All of this does result in a slight reduction of the amount of enzymes that are going to end up in this kernel when it comes time for us to use it in our brewing process. And as we're going to learn as we go through this process, those enzymes are a key component in converting starches into sugars and getting those fermentable sugars into our final beer for fermentation. So logically, this means that unmodified malts tend to have a more complete set of those enzymes. But with that comes more proteins, and with more proteins, a greater chance of protein polyphenol-induced haze, the haze that brewers commonly refer to as chill haze. The maltster's goal is to find that balance to allow the barley kernels to germinate, but also maximize the potential yield of starches from the barley. Having that in mind, not only are undermodified malts becoming less common in the brewing process, they're also becoming increasingly harder to find. When and if they're even used at all, these undermodified malts require an extensive protein rest as part of the mash schedule. We will be discussing mash and mash steps in its own section coming up, so more on that in the future. For now, this is just the start of our malt discussion. But as we do with all of our subjects, we're breaking them down into smaller, easy-to-review pieces. So on that note, we're headed on to the next lesson, and I'll see you there.